Imagine a world where love conquers hatred, where forgiveness triumphs over revenge, and where the purity of one's heart is the measure of true wealth. This is the revolutionary vision presented by Jesus of Nazareth in his Sermon on the Mount, a set of teachings that has shaped civilizations and continues to challenge our understanding of morality, spirituality, and human nature. So imagine yourself on that hillside in ancient Galilee. The air is thick with anticipation as a humble carpenter from Nazareth with long hair and beard begins to speak. You don't know this at this time, but the words that you are about to hear are going to turn the world upside down. Blessed are the poor in spirit, Jesus says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And with this paradoxical statement, Jesus sets the stage for a radical message. This is episode 45. If you're not already subscribed to this podcast, do subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you're listening to it. And if you are enjoying my work and want to support it, you can head over to my Substack. The link is in the description, or on Patreon, and become a paying member. And thank you to all those who are already supporting my work. Let's get into it. Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you shall eat and what you shall drink, nor about your body, what you shall put on it. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you, by being anxious, can add 1 cubit to his span of life? And why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not so much clothe you, O you of little faith? Therefore, do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be yours as well. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Let the day's own trouble be sufficient for the day. That is an excerpt from the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is a collection of teachings that's found in the Gospel of Matthew between chapter 5 and chapter 7. And it's given by Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus is one of, if not the most influential figure in human history. For Christians, Jesus is the promised Messiah, the Christ, the Logos made flesh, the one who died and resurrected to save all mankind. For us today, we're looking at his most famous teaching, the Sermon on the Mount. The sermon, as indicated by the name, takes place on a mountain. And mountains in all the great religions of the world are symbolic of man's spiritual ascent. Mountains were often where people went to go for nourishment, to rejuvenate, to be alone, to be in solitude, to go speak to God. Mountains signify the highest point in the world that's naturally occurring. And many temples and churches, as a result, are built on mountains. So the fact that the Sermon on the Mount takes place on a mountain is indicating to us that the message that Jesus is giving is extremely important. And if you know your Torah, then you remember when Moses went up to Mount Sinai and he encountered Yahweh, or God. It was there that he received the 10 Commandments. And as the story goes, Moses was also physically transformed by his encounter with God on the mountain. And so when he came back down, his face was shining, so much so that he had to cover it up. And in the beginning of the sermon, Jesus goes on to say that he has not come to destroy the laws that Moses has given, but rather that he has come to fulfill them. And the fulfillment of the laws of Moses is best summarized later on in the book of Matthew in chapter 22, verse 36 to 40, when somebody asks Jesus, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replies, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." The Sermon on the Mount is an exposition of this reply that Jesus gives when he is asked, which is the greatest commandment in the law? What I find fascinating is that chapter 15 in the Dhammapada, which are the wisdoms of Buddha, starts very much like the Beatitude. And I'm going to read both so that you can see what I mean. So to start with the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount, I read, "Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So now we go to chapter 15 in the Dhammapada or Canto 15. And I read, "Blessed indeed are we who live among those who hate, hating no one. Amidst those who hate, let us dwell without hatred. Blessed indeed are we who live among those who are ailing without ailments. Amidst those who are so afflicted, let us live in good health. Blessed indeed are we who live among those who are yearning for sense delights, without yearning for such things. Amidst those who are yearning for sense delights, let us dwell without yearning. Happy indeed are we who live without possessions. Let us feed on happiness, like the radiant gods who feed on spiritual bliss. Victory breeds enmity. The vanquished ones dwell in sorrow. The composed person lives happily, disregarding both victory and defeat." So the opening of chapter 15, "Blessed indeed are we who live among those who hate, hating no one. Amidst those who hate, let us dwell without hatred." The opening verse and the end of the Beatitude teachings that we will live amongst and besides people who hate us and revile us and spread rumors about us, but that we should live amongst them, beside them, embrace them, and we should rejoice and not harbor any hatred towards them. This is the message that Jesus is giving, and this is the message also that we find in the Dhammapada by the Buddha, right? To live amongst those who hate without hating anybody. And with Jesus, he says, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." The Beatitudes work in such a way that each one builds upon the other, meaning that you cannot have one without the other. And we'll see this very shortly. So to go with the first, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." This is a radical message. The kingdom of heaven as Jesus goes on to explain and expound, is not actually a place to go to, but rather something that is within us. And this is the key, and this is why Jesus opens with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." It is only by having a poor spirit, meaning a heart of humility, does one have access to the kingdom of heaven. And this kingdom, again, is not of this earth, but rather of something eternal, something that we cannot see. Right? The kingdom of heaven is that which our eyes cannot see, that our hands cannot touch, for it can only be seen by the pure in heart and touched by the meek in spirit. And this is because this kingdom of heaven that Jesus speaks about is love, is this eternal happiness. And it's not the emotional, ephemeral sensation of love, right, that is often portrayed in our media, portrayed in our society, but rather the deep, grounded wisdom and beauty that's surrounding all of us. This love is the eternal Logos, the Word, the eternal Tao that Lao Tzu speaks about. But without humility, you're blinded from this love, right? We cannot perceive this truth. We cannot escape the self-created Maya, the illusion, this cage that we've built around ourselves, that we are unconnected from others, that we live for ourselves and only for ourselves. And this illusion that we've built, thinking that this life is about continually striving for more possessions in this material world and more status and more glory and more honor. This is the illusion that blinds us, that actually prevents us from accessing, from gaining access to the kingdom of heaven. We will never find the eternal, unmoving, unending, ever-present, ever-nourishing happiness we seek in this material world. Right? Hence, Jesus is teaching that the kingdom of heaven will be inherited by the poor in spirit, right? The ones who have a heart of humility, the ones who understand that we must extend grace and love to those around us, right? Those of us who are poor in spirit. And the poor in spirit also refers to those who may be suffering today or tomorrow, but who continue to live a life of love, of hope, of generosity, of kindness, right? And they are able to do this because they can see with their hearts the invisible, all-pervading Logos, the Tao. And these are the ones on the path to eternity, the ones who have the kingdom of heaven within them. And so it reminds me of what Lao Tzu wrote in the Tao Te Ching. Looked at, and he's talking about Tao, looked at but not seen, listened to but not heard, grasped for but not held, formless, soundless, intangible. The Tao resists and defies comprehension. Its arising is not about light, its setting not a matter of darkness, unnameable, unending, emerging continually and continually pouring back into nothingness. It is formless form, unseeable image, elusive, evasive, unimaginable mystery. Confront it and you won't see its face. Follow it and you can't find an end. Perceive its ancient subtle heart, however, and you become master of the moment. Know what came before time, and the beginning of wisdom is yours. And so similarly, the kingdom of heaven that Jesus speaks about is unnameable, unending, emerging continually. It cannot be seen. It is formless. It is soundless. It is intangible. It cannot be held by hands. It cannot be heard by ears, but can be seen by the heart. Perceive, to quote Lao Tzu, perceive its ancient subtle heart, however, and you become master of the moment. Know what came before time, and the beginning of wisdom is yours. The other aspect of this relates back to the excerpt I read, when Jesus says, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. And right there, you get the same message. You become master of the moment when you perceive and understand the kingdom of heaven, in that only this moment is what is real. It is what exists. And to be anxious about tomorrow, to be anxious about the past, destroys your ability to fully appreciate and exist in this moment. And the last part of what Lao Tzu says, and the beginning of wisdom is yours. So to find the kingdom of heaven, we must begin with gaining wisdom. And wisdom is only found when you realize and admit that you don't know, right? That you are lacking something. And this is having a heart of humility, right? Being poor in spirit. And it reminded me of the Symposium, an episode that we've done with Plato. Right? Plato, through Socrates, says that the lover, or eros, is one who is between wisdom and ignorance. Right? If you remember from that episode, the story of Eros and how Eros was born is that his father was abundance and his mother was poverty. And so the mother, poverty, thought by getting together with the father that she will never lack anything again. And she gives birth to Eros. And Eros, being the son of abundance and mother, was in between. And for that reason, Eros was always seeking wisdom, and in one sense has his other foot in ignorance. And for that reason, perpetually seeking after wisdom, right? Seeking after beauty. So too then, we must be poor in spirit to gain and to inherit the kingdom of heaven. And so the next part of the Beatitude is, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. We mourn, if you think about it, when we lose something we hold dear to. We don't mourn for something that we don't care about. And in this case, right, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. When we see the kingdom of heaven, right, when we perceive it, the eternal beauty, and realize that all our other things are transient, right? All other things will fade. They're all vanity. We mourn in the sense that others haven't seen this truth as well. And also that it took us so long to find this truth, to understand this. And so you're mourning in this way, not in a pessimistic manner, but rather like when you fall deeply in love with your spouse and think to yourself, why didn't I find you earlier? I wasted so much of my time fooling around, looking at all the wrong places, all the stupid places, right? So that mourning that you have here when you found it, that is the mourning we're referring to here. The mourning is both of yourself, but also for others who have not yet seen the truth of love. But you're able to only mourn in this way once you've inherited the kingdom of heaven. And you only inherit the kingdom of heaven by having a spirit of poverty, by having a spirit of humility, a heart of humility. So you're starting to see here what I mean, that the Beatitudes build upon each other. The next part of the Beatitude is, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Augustine, an early Christian theologian and philosopher, in his commentary on this verse, writes, then the meek are those who yield to acts of wickedness, and do not resist evil, but overcome evil with good. Let those then who are not meek quarrel and fight for earthly and temporal things. What Augustine is meaning by those who are meek are ones who do not resist evil, but overcome evil with good, is that the meek are ones who have seen the truth, seen the eternal, have love, have the kingdom of heaven, understand that to fight evil with evil is not the answer, for it will only create more evil. Instead, they are able to fight evil with good by acting rightly, by acting justly. And so meek here is referring to those who are kind, to those who care for their neighbor and to love their neighbor. But you can only do this if you have first mourned, right? If you have first apprehended the eternal beauty. The next part is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Right? You can only hunger and thirst for righteousness when you are meek, when you have kindness in you, when you are loving your neighbor. Only then will you hunger and thirst for righteousness, because you see the injustice around you, because you see and perceive truth, perceive reality as it is, right? Seeking justice and acting rightly are very difficult things to do, because we are constantly tempted to do otherwise. If you don't have the sense of meekness. And meekness is not shyness, to be very clear here. It's not somebody who's shy and somebody who hides from confrontation, somebody who hides from challenges. Meekness is being able to stand firm in your conviction in the midst of suffering, to hold firm in what you believe in the midst of persecution, in the midst of others reviling you. And so Jesus says, only the meek ultimately are the ones who hunger for righteousness and thirst for it, and they shall be satisfied. Then the next part of the Beatitude is, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And so building again on this, Jesus says, you can only be merciful if you are hungry and thirsty for righteousness. You can only understand mercy once you've apprehended what it means to be righteous and to be just. Until then, you're parading a false sense of justice and righteousness. Oftentimes, it's vengeful and spiteful, because that's naturally what we are when we don't understand righteousness, when we don't have humility. But when you fully understand true righteousness, then you are filled with a sense of mercy, for you see reality for itself without the illusion of self-righteousness and judgment, right? You see beyond the veil of Maya, the cloud of ignorance. And so you're able to begin to show mercy in your action, and true mercy, not mercy with a sense of wanting something later on, right? But mercy in that you are giving freely and generously. And you're showing kindness without expecting something from the other. And you're extending grace to others. And so the next part of the Beatitude is, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Through the Spirit of mercy, your heart is purified and cleansed. And in this, you are able to see God. It's not seeing God like you see another person, right? No, you see God instead in your neighbor, in your enemy, in your child, in your friend, in the cosmos, in all the things around you. And this is the point that the Sufis make with the idea of the path of annihilation, or itlaq, or fana. There's an episode on the Sufi, I haven't listened to it, check that one out. And the point that they make is, for it is only the pure in heart who have killed their ego, because you can only kill your ego if you have cleansed yourself. And in so doing, you are finally able to go beyond this cloud of ignorance, the Maya, and into the cloud of unknowing, to be united in the eternal garden with the One, the ultimate reality. And this is why Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And this is the heart of the Beatitude. This is the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. Only the pure in heart will see God, right? They will unite with the One. And through this, we're finally able to see the truth that God is not some being far off in some high heavens, like a deistic God, uncaring, disconnected from the cosmos, but rather that God is in all things, is in your neighbor, that your neighbor, your enemy, your friend, your lover, your child, they are made in the image of God, and therefore God exists in them. And this is why you find in the book of Psalms, which is in the Old Testament, Psalms 139, 7-12, we read, where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. And if I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the utmost part of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is bright as day, for darkness is as light with you. The author of the psalm is saying, everywhere I go, no matter how far or how deep, how high, how wide, wherever I go, God is there. And you're unable to escape from it once you see the truth. And why Jesus writes, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. You see that all things, in a very real sense, contain God in them. And so you can do no other but to show mercy, to extend kindness, to extend grace and mercy. So then Jesus goes on to say, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Now, once you've seen God, right? Once you see that the other person, your enemy, is made in the image of God, and therefore is, in one sense, divine, you can do no other than to be a peacemaker, to help heal this broken world, this world filled with strife and killing. You're moved to become a peacemaker. People who look to resolve feuds and hatred, these are the peacemakers, right? To reconcile and to live in peace. And in embodying this principle, what will happen is that your life will become harder. And Jesus goes on to say, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." In becoming a peacemaker, you will be persecuted, you will be hated, you will be reviled, tossed out. It doesn't mean your life will constantly be filled with misery. It means rather that not everyone will appreciate your peacemaking. Not everyone will want to see the truth that God is in your neighbor, is in the enemy. Some will purposely want to live a life of hatred, as we read in the Dhammapada chapter 15, because it gives them a sense of power to act. And for this reason, Jesus says, you will be persecuted for righteousness' sake, for trying to embody the Beatitudes, and ultimately you'll be hated by men because of the Beatitude. So then Jesus goes on to say, "Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you falsely on my account." And this last part ends with, "Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so men persecuted the prophets who were before you." To summarize the Beatitude, right, the kingdom of heaven is not something material. It's not a nation. It's not made up of a particular ethno-national group, as some people would like to believe. Instead, the kingdom of heaven is in our hearts. It is there, but only the pure in heart can see it. Only the righteous who truly seek after righteousness will see it. Only the meek in spirit, only the poor in spirit will see it. And it's because the kingdom of heaven is love. And as Jesus teaches, all the laws of the prophets hang on the two commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind and with all your soul, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The kingdom of God that Jesus of Nazareth repeatedly teaches is in fact about love. It is that which no eyes can see, no ears can hear, no hands can touch. And it reminded me of the book The Little Prince, which is an episode that I've done, when the fox is a character that the little prince meets when he crash lands on Earth. And the fox says to the little prince, "And now here is my secret, a very simple secret. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye." And it is invisible to the eye because the kingdom of heaven is not an earthly kingdom. It is not something that you can touch. It is only something that you can see with a pure heart. And this is why Jesus later on in the Sermon on the Mount goes on to say, "Do not lay up for yourself treasure on earth, where moth and rust consume, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Before Jesus gets to this part about storing up treasures where moth and rust don't consume, he spends a significant time teaching that it is our internal state of mind that matters, not the external. And it's because he wants people to understand that the most important lesson is all the commandments hang on love. Love of God and love of neighbor. And so he goes on to give two examples of this. And they are of anger and of lust. Of anger, Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said to the men of old, 'You shall not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to counsel. If you truly loved your neighbor, your brother, your sister, your parents, your friend, you wouldn't murder them. You wouldn't harm them, for true love is desiring the good of the other, and in harming them and in murdering them, it shows that you do not have love, that you do not truly love them. And so Jesus extends this and says, well, even by you holding on to anger and grudges against your brother, against your sister, means that you aren't living in love. So what you should do is you should go and reconcile with these people before you can reconcile with God. In the opening of the Dhammapada, we find a verse that reads, the hatred of those who do not harbor such ill feelings as he reviled me, assaulted me, vanquished me, and robbed me is easily pacified. Then the verse that follows is, through hatred, hatreds are never appeased. Through non-hatred are hatred always appeased. And this is the law eternal. And this is the point that Jesus is making. More hatred never appeases. It is only non-hatred. Or rather, it is love that always appeases. And so Jesus says, go and reconcile. And for the Buddha says, this is the eternal law, or the law eternal. Then Jesus goes on to give another example on lust, when he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. If you truly love someone, you wouldn't objectify them. You wouldn't lust after them and their bodies, because by objectifying them, you reduce them to an object, like an inanimate thing without dignity or personhood. So if you truly love somebody, Jesus says, then you wouldn't look at a man or a woman lustfully because you want to uphold this person's honor, their dignity, their sense of personhood. And this shows that you love your neighbor as yourself. And here the Buddha says something quite similar. And I quote, the pleasure seeker who finds delight in physical objects, whose senses are unsubdued, him, Mara, which is evil, prevails against, as does the monsoon wind against a weak-rooted tree. The Buddha goes on to say, the one who has overcome his senses, who is not consumed by sensual pleasures, the evil one cannot prevail against, like the monsoon wind that blows against a strong-rooted tree that is not blown off, that is not blown down. So Jesus is getting to the essence of the law of Moses here. It's not about whether you've actually gone and killed somebody or whether you've actually gone and committed adultery. The question is whether your heart is pure. For it is not what's outside that makes you unclean, but what is inside, which is another lesson that Jesus goes on to teach when he's talking to the Pharisees and the teachers of the laws. To summarize so far, it's that our actions should be the result of our interior life, because the other way around doesn't work, right? No outward action can make the interior life pure, can make your heart pure. No amount of ritualistic prayer, no amount of ritualistic bowing and genuflecting can make your heart pure. It could coax us towards it, sure. But ultimately, we have to make that intentional decision, right, to purify the heart. And so we can follow the laws, but the important thing is that the core of our intention and our motivation, and that is what Jesus is getting at. Blessed are the pure in heart. And so from here, Jesus goes on to say that teaching, which I read earlier, do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust consume, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus is saying, store up things that matter, things that will not rust, things that are eternal, like love, generosity, mercy, forgiveness. These are the things that matter. These are the things what you can call spiritual wealth, that not only will make your life more beautiful, more holy, but also make your life more meaningful, more purposeful. Because so many of us live lives that feel purposeless, that feel meaningless. And oftentimes it's because we know that we lack these aspects of love, of generosity, of forgiveness, of grace, of mercy. And not to generalize too much here, but if you've come across monks from different religions, what you often find is that they have a great sense of calmness, of serenity, of happiness that seems to go beyond this world. And part of that is because they are storing for themselves things that truly matter, things that will last forever, like love. This is a lesson that repeats in essentially many of the ancient wisdom books that we've been looking at. Say very similar things. That we must forgive each other, that we must extend grace and mercy to others. But Jesus knows this is hard, and that's why he says, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. This way of living is difficult, and there is no easy way about it. It is narrow, but it is the path that will lead to life, that will lead to a life that is fulfilling, a life that is filled with meaning and with purpose. If you do not want that, then go through the gate that is wide. Store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust will consume. Lay up for yourself treasures and honors and status to impress those around you. Do those things, Jesus says, if you want a life that leads to destruction. And destruction here, and obviously Jesus used hyperbolic language all the time in the Gospels. But his point is, if you live a life like this, it will actually lead to a more destructive, more painful existence, because you will soon find out that all is vanity. And perhaps you might find out too late when you're near the end of your life. You remember the episode that we did on Paul Kalanithi, who was a neurosurgeon, where he spent his whole life becoming one of the best neurosurgeons. And at a very young age, around 36, 37, he finds out that he has stage 4 cancer. And 22 months or so later, he dies. And when you read the memoir, you see a transition of a man who starts to face his mortality and starts to ask the questions that all the great spiritual teachers are teaching us. What is the point of this life? Why am I doing what I am doing? And Paul Kalanithi, then near the end of the book, he realizes that all the things that he had been striving after, the status, the honors, the recognition, they are nothing. They are useless. They are completely ephemeral. What is important is the love that he has for his wife and his newborn daughter. And that, to him, becomes more precious than gold and than ruby. But the point is, you don't have to be on the verge of death to realize this. Jesus is teaching us this. The Buddha teaches us this. Lao Tzu teaches us this. We find this in almost all the ancient wisdom literature. But as Jesus says, not many people will follow this path. And that's why he says, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter it are many. And he goes on to say, everyone who then hears these words of mine, does them, will be like a wise man who built his house upon the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. a verse that we find in the Dhammapada, verse 81. We read, "As a solid rock is not shaken by the wind, so the wise are not shaken by censure or praise." Now that you've heard these words from Jesus and from the Buddha, if you take these words and implement it into your life, if you live a life as Jesus is teaching and as the Buddha is teaching, then you will be like a man who built his house upon the rock. When the storm comes, the rock stands firmly and is not shaken by it. But if you do not do this, then you will be like a fool who builds his house upon the sand. It's easy to build, it's fast to build. But when the rain comes and the storm comes and the flood comes, the whole thing will be wiped out. You don't want to get to the end of the life and realize that you've been doing it all incorrectly and you only have a few months, a few years to make it up. You have now this time that you've heard it until the end. It could be tomorrow, it could be 10 years from now, it could be 30, 40 years from now. But to live a life filled with love is the eternal message, the eternal law that we find in all the books that we've looked at so far. So Jesus goes on in the Sermon on the Mount to say, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." And mammon here just means wealth. So Jesus is saying, you cannot serve both God and wealth. You cannot serve both the things of this world and the spiritual life. Either you will end up hating one and loving the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You just cannot have it both ways. It's important to caveat that Jesus is not saying that wealth is bad, that money is bad, but rather that if you are consumed by wealth, if you're consumed by the materiality of this world, then you will end up hating God because you will devote yourself to money, to wealth. And in there you will lose yourself. You will go through the wide gate. You will be the man who builds his house upon sand. Again, it reminds me of something that's found in the Dhammapada. I read verse 186. "There is no satisfying the passions even by a shower of gold coins. The wise man, knowing the sense delights are of fleeting pleasure and productive of pain, finds no joy even in celestial pleasures. The true disciple of the fully enlightened one delights only in the destruction of all worldly desires." Our desires are often the cause of our suffering. The more we desire, the more we want, it perpetuates this idea that we need more, that we constantly need to have more and more things. And it causes more destruction because we hold on to these things. And when we lose these things, we mourn, but we mourn for the wrong things, right? So the Buddha in verse 203 later says, "Greed is the worst of afflictions. Mental and emotional tendencies are the greatest of sorrows. Having perceived this fact truly, one realizes nirvana, the highest bliss." And this lines up with what Jesus says, "For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few." The fact is, greed is what makes us suffer. But when you perceive this truth, when you're able to see beyond the illusion and see that all the mental and emotional suffering, the sorrow that we have is the result of our greed, then we can see reality for itself and we are able to enter the gate that is narrow, that leads to life. And for the Buddha is the one who perceives this truth is the one who realizes nirvana, the highest bliss. If you haven't read the Sermon on the Mount, I recommend reading it. But the last part that I wanted to look at is when Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun shine on the evil and on the good, and sends a rain on the just and on the unjust." This is speaking to the aspect that we all struggle with, and I struggle with too. And it's with loving those who hurt us, to forgive them, to extend grace. It is very, very difficult when you are forgiving, or when you're trying to forgive somebody who has hurt you, who has damaged your reputation, who continues to speak ill of you because they harbor some sort of hatred towards you or your family. It hurts to forgive them, to be kind to them when you meet them. But Jesus is saying, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, so that you may see God, because you have a pure heart. For God, Jesus says, makes the sun shine on both the evil and the good. Right? He does not discriminate, and he sends rain on the just and unjust. We like to think that by harboring anger in our hearts against those who have hurt us, we are somehow taking revenge on these people. But in reality, it is us who's getting hurt. It's like holding a heap of hot coals in our hand and thinking that we're burning the other person, when in reality, it is only our own hands that's being inflamed. So we must love, we must forgive, because to love is to forgive. And in forgiveness, true freedom is found. For Jesus says, for your Father makes his sun shine on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. So then we too can extend grace and forgiveness to others and forgive them. Now, the challenge for this week is one, to focus on purifying our hearts and intentions rather than just following external rules and rituals. Right? This is what Jesus is teaching us. The second thing is love and forgiveness. Actively work on loving others. Right? That includes your enemies. Those include the people who hurt you the most. Practicing forgiveness is one of the hardest things to do. There's a very famous story in India of a family called the Staines, and they were doctors. And the husband and two of the sons were burnt alive in a jeep in the middle of the night. Mr. Staines' wife, Mrs. Staines, and her daughter survived. And the story is famous because Mrs. Staines goes on to forgive the murderers, the ones who killed her husband, her 10 and 12-year-old son. And this is central to Jesus' teaching. And it's also essential for us if we want to find peace, if we want to inherit the kingdom of heaven. And lastly, number 3, is to invest, or is to pour ourselves in the intangible treasures where moth and rust do not consume. Right? These are things like love, generosity, seeking wisdom, forgiveness, being merciful. And this is what Jesus teaches about laying up treasures in heaven. And with that, I'll wrap. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you're not already subscribed, do subscribe to the podcast. Give it a 5-star rating. If you want to support this work, if you found this work helpful, share it with a friend, give it a rating, and consider becoming a paid subscriber on Patreon or on my Substack. The Substack is the easiest. And don't forget to subscribe to my Substack. Each week, I send out a weekly email with a condensed version of this episode. And once a month, I'm writing an essay. Till next week, peace.